Oh boy. This one's gonna be really big. Hello and welcome back to Vinyl Friday, the Revolver Odyssey. This is it, folks. We've made it. We have been on this track-by-track voyage through the album Revolver by the Beatles since February of this year, and it has been a trip. We've journeyed through an acerbic indictment of the UK tax system, an orchestral tragedy in 3 acts, an ode to lethargy. We have traveled through a portal to non-Western musical traditions, and back again just in time to catch a song for Paul's father. Love never dies, watching her eyes and hoping I'm always. Paul uses these chords to get into the B part. We got to be a fly on the wall for one of the most playful parties of the 1960s. We dissed Peter Fonda. We saluted life's simple pleasures. Good day, sunshine. We received a primer in power pop. We mourned a dying love. We received directions to a guy who can hook us up and boogie. We tried to listen to what George Harrison wanted to tell us, but he couldn't get the words out. There. And last time, we learned what it sounds like when you shove a microphone down the bell of a trumpet. Now we find ourselves here, standing at the threshold to the doors of perception. If we open this door, we will hear a piece of music which blends the most contemporary of Western sounds with the most ancient of Eastern. We will witness the genesis of multiple technological innovations that are still in use to this day. We will look on at the limits of popular music being broadened and redefined. Quite frankly, our minds will be blown. And more importantly, we will never be the same again. Are you ready for that? I thought so. Come along. God, this truly is a remarkable piece of music. Let us recapitulate. The Beatles wrapped the recording of their previous album, Rubber Soul, in about the middle of November of 1965. Beep, 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 yeah! They performed the last concert of their UK tour in about mid-December 1965. Don't care. And after all of that, their manager Brian Epstein wanted them to follow this up with a third film following the success of their 1964 film, A Hard Day's Night, and their 1965 film, Help. But the Beatles were tired, and they did not want to do this. No, Brian, they said, we will not. They knew that they weren't due back in the studio to record their next album until early April of 1966. Which meant that for the first time in approximately 4 years, the Beatles were able to take a break. It is at this point that I need to tell you about a criminally underrated children's cartoon from the 80s and 90s. It's a tenuous metaphor, but stay with me. The name of the show is Captain Planet.
By your powers combined, I am Captain Planet!
And it follows these 5 teenagers endowed with superpowers who are trying to save the environment. Whenever they get stuck, which is often because they are absolutely hopeless, especially when the superpowers are taken into account, they can combine all of their powers.
Fire! Wind! Water! Heart! Go Planet!
Heart! And summon Captain Planet, a superhero.
Captain Planet, he's our hero.
And that's exactly how Tomorrow Never Knows came about. Doesn't make sense? Don't sweat it, I will return to this analogy. Here is how the Beatles spent their winter and early spring 1966 sabbatical. Let's start with Paul. John, George, and Ringo had all bought extravagant homes in the suburbs, where they now lived. John at Kenwood, Ringo at Sunny Heights, and George in this expensive bungalow in Esher. Thank you to everybody who corrected my pronunciation. As a quick aside, I think it's really adorable that they all bought houses so close to each other. Except Paul, who from around 1963 to 1966 lived in what was essentially the attic of his girlfriend Jane Asher's parents' house, crucially, in central London. Jane's family were artsy types, cultured types. For example, Jane's mother was a professor at the Guildhall School of Music and Art. And this family introduced Paul to art and culture that he had never before experienced. We'll go now to the Storytime correspondent, who will tell us a little more. Now, this song has an excellent story, so you folks are going to be seeing a lot of me this episode. Strap in! We will be taking today's first reading from The Good Book. While the others had got married and moved out to suburbia, I had stayed in London and got into the art scene through friends like Robert Fraser and Barry Miles. We opened the Indica Gallery with John Dunbar, Peter Asher, and people like that. I always contend that I had quite a big period of this before John really got into it. It was only later when he went out with Yoko that he got back into London and visited all the galleries. So in spending time with Jane's brother Peter, yes, the Peter of Peter and Gordon,
I don't care what they say, I won't stay in a world without love,
and his friend Barry Miles, Paul was introduced to the music of composers like Karlheinz Stockhausen, who were experimenting with a genre of music called musique concrète. One piece was all little plink-plonks and interesting ideas. In effect, instead of using instruments, the music is composed using pre-recorded sounds, which are often electronically altered, so sped up, played backwards, played in a loop, etc. We always think of John as being the avant-garde one, with Yoko and so on, but at that time, John was living a comfortable suburban life in Weybridge. Enter John Lennon. Now, while Paul had been spending his sabbatical, broadening his mind, exposing himself to... That's not what I mean. Familiarizing himself with new circles of creative thinkers, John was broadening his mind with the use of chemicals. In the previous year, he had consumed acid several times, and he was quite enamored of the experience. He was really taken with it. So at some point during their time off, John accompanies Paul to the aforementioned Indica Gallery in search of works by Nietzsche, who is a man with far too many consonants in his name and also a philosopher. He did find what he was looking for. He also found something that he was not looking for, but which would leave an enormous impression. Paul's new friend Barry Miles handed him a new book that had just arrived by the authors Timothy Leary, Ralph Metzner, and Ram Dass, who was not going by that name at that point, but that's irrelevant to our story. The book was called The Psychedelic Experience, and John was immediately absorbed. Barry Miles himself says, John was delighted and curled up with the book on the old settee we had in the middle of the shop. It was one of life's great simple pleasures, I think, to curl up on a comfy couch and read a good book. Sort of like this, I guess. The book refers to concepts like the game existence and the void, and also this.
Whenever in doubt, turn off your mind, relax, float downstream.
In John's words, Leary was the one going around saying, take it, take it, take it. And we followed his instructions in his How to Take a Trip book. I did it just like he said in the book, and then I wrote Tomorrow Never Knows, which was almost the first Acid song. Lay down all thoughts, surrender to the void, and all that shit which Leary had pinched from Book of the Dead. Let's look now to George. During the making of Help, they were filming a scene in which a group of musicians were playing Indian instruments in the background. And George was very intrigued by these instruments. Shortly thereafter, David Crosby of the Byrds introduced George to the music of Ravi Shankar, according to David Crosby. This is the same David Crosby who, while they were in LA in 1965, had done Acid with George and John. Acid had had a profound impact on George as well. He had gone from being an atheist to somebody who believed incontrovertibly in the existence of a higher power. And it's sort of a combination of these elements that caused George to immerse himself in the religious and philosophical traditions of India while he was on his sabbatical. And he spent a good deal of it listening to and learning to play Indian music. And what was Ringo up to while the others were filling their brain pans with new ideas? Truthfully, I don't know. So far as I can tell, he grew a beard. So as established, John has read this book. He writes a song, the group brings it to George Martin. I remember being in Brian Epstein's house in Chapel Street. We met up and John had a song that was all in the chord of C.
Which in our minds was okay, like Indian music's all on one chord. It's a perfectly good idea. I was wondering how George Martin was going to take it, because it was a bit of a radical departure, you know. At least we'd had 3 chords and maybe a change for the middle 8 even, you know. Suddenly this was just John just strumming on C rather earnestly.
George Martin took it very well. He said, "Rather interesting, John. Jolly interesting." I think this is quite cute because they didn't realize that George Martin had more experience with musique concrète than any of them. I used to do a lot of experimenting with musique concrète. Speeding up tapes, making funny noises and plucking piano strings, that kind of thing.
Tape and electronics have brought an enormous new field to music. It's surprising what you can do once you have a sound recorded on tape. You can speed it up, you can slow it down, you can turn it round back to front. You can compress it, equalize it, add echo. There's a whole range of things you can do.
In 1962, he had worked with Maddalena Fagandini of the BBC Radiophonic Workshop on an experimental single which featured a combination of tape loops, electronic sounds, and live instruments. It was released under the pseudonym Ray Cathode. It sounds like this. He'd also done a lot of work recording The Goon Show, and that obviously had required the use of a bunch of different sound effects. Just prior to the beginning of the recording sessions for Revolver, like a few days before, a very young Geoff Emerick had been promoted from assistant engineer to main engineer, and he also had some experience working with tape loops, because he had worked on World Record Club sessions for some of their Shakespeare productions which used musique concrète as part of the show. So there are your main characters with their unique abilities and experiences. I don't mean to flog a dead metaphor, but by their powers combined,
By your powers combined,
they are about to summon a truly heroic piece of music. Okay, so it's day 1 of the recording sessions for Revolver. Yes, Tomorrow Never Knows is the very first thing that they worked on for this album, straight out the gate. Tomorrow Never Knows. Sure, John brings forward this song for them to work on. As we know, he has a head full of the psychedelic experience, which is very loosely based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And he may have had this on the brain because his first directive was that he wanted to sound like the Dalai Lama chanting from a hilltop with 1,000 Tibetan monks. And I said, it's a bit expensive going to Tibet. Can we make do with it here? It is Geoff Emerick's first day on the job, and he is eager to win the approval of the Beatles because they're already a little bit wary of him, as they had a totally different engineer working with them on the previous couple of albums, and he's also a little bit younger than they are. But he put this nervous zeal to work. EMI Studios had a rotating Leslie speaker, which is usually connected to Hammond organs. It's what gives them their characteristic warble, and it looks like this. The Beatles had, in a sort of unorthodox fashion, connected the Leslie speaker to a guitar on It's Only Love. But Geoff decided to take this a step further and suggested that they feed John Lennon's microphone output through the Leslie speaker in order to achieve this Dalai Lama sound. This had never been done before. Here's George Martin's account. I spoke to Geoff Emerick, the engineer, and he had a good idea. He said, let's try putting his voice through a Leslie speaker and back again and re-recording it. By putting his voice through that and then recording it again, you got a kind of intermittent vibrato effect. So it's day 1, they're already breaking new ground. But Geoff Emerick made perhaps an even more revolutionary innovation on that same day. This next reading is from Geoff Emerick's Here, There, and Everywhere. And don't come for me, I know that he's not always the most reliable narrator. But he was there, and we weren't, so we're going to give him the time of day, but we're going to take it with a grain of salt. Okay? Good. Concerned about the wear and tear on their expensive collection of microphones, the top studio brass had warned us never to place mics any closer than 2 feet to drums, especially the bass drum, which put out such a wallop of low frequencies. It seemed to me, though, that if I moved all the drum mics in closer, say just a few inches away, we would hear a distinctly different tonal quality, one which I thought would suit the song. I knew I might get a bollocking from the studio manager for doing so, but my curiosity was piqued. I really wanted to hear what it would sound like. This is a huge part of why Revolver sounds so much punchier, so much heavier, and frankly, from a recording perspective, so much better than their previous albums. It is a good thing that this technological advance was made just in time to capture some of Ringo's best work as the drummer of the Beatles. Ringo says, "I was proud of my drumming on Tomorrow Never Knows, but I was quite proud of my drumming all the way through, really." Damn straight. The earlier drum takes of the song are played much more straight. But fairly early on, Paul McCartney pulled Ringo to the side and made some suggestions as to different patterns that he could explore. It's interesting because this gives us a glimpse into Paul's arrangement savvy. This wasn't just a suggestion for Ringo and for the drum part, but in fact was a suggestion for the entire rhythm section, because if you listen closely, you can hear that Paul on bass is reinforcing what Ringo is doing with the drums. That little skip-hop thing that happens in the middle of the bar, Paul's also doing that. It helps to drive the song along. Have a listen. The drum part goes bum, 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 and the bass part goes bum 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 ba-dun dum bum 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 ba-dun dum. Do you hear it? So that wasn't Paul just being like, "Ringo, this is how you play the drums." It was him going, "Hey Ringo, I think it would be really good if the two of us played this together. It would make the rhythm section stronger." Great arrangement choice there from young Paul McCartney. 23 years old at the time. And the end result is that Ringo's drum part just sounds like Ticket to Ride on steroids, you know? It sounds like he's unleashed a beast. Moving right along. Fairly momentous arrangement choice from Paul, but far from his most radical on this recording session. As we know, Paul has spent most of winter and early spring mingling with London's artsy counterculture, which was sort of a small niche scene. And he thought it would be a good idea to bring some of the concepts that he's been exploring and experiencing and absorbing to this new project with the Beatles. He had 2 Brunel machines, and he would use this to create these tape loops. He learned that you could unhook the erase head, so the tape would go round and round and round, but keep recording, and the tape would end up saturating. It was Paul, really, who experimented with his tape machine at home.
So I decided to do some of those loops that I've been doing on my own tape recorder.
He explained to the other boys how he had done this, and Ringo and George would do the same and bring me different loops of sounds. According to George Martin, in the end they brought 40 or 50 individual tape loops that they had made to the studio for him to listen to. Everybody went home and made up a spool, a loop. "Okay, class, now I want you all to go home and come back in the morning with your own loop." We were touching on the Stockhausen kind of avant-garde clue music. Ha ha ha. Ha ha. Editor Nancy here. I've just realised that the Storytime correspondent forgot to include one of the best anecdotes about the tape loops, so this is Ringo speaking. "I had my own little setup to record them. As George says, we were drinking a lot of tea in those days, and on all my tapes you can hear, oh, I hope I've switched it on. I'd get so deranged from strong tea, I'd sit there for hours making those noises." So he went through all of them, played them forwards, backwards at different speeds, and then selected a few that would work well for the song. These are the loops, in no particular order. 1. A clip of orchestral music. 2. Paul fiddling around on his mellotron on the string setting. 3. Paul fiddling around on his mellotron on the flute setting. 4. Georgia supplied sitar clips. And the last one is Paul laughing. That sort of seagully sound. It's actually Paul laughing. Up until this point, I feel like George Martin didn't have much of a creative outlet in the Beatles. His job had basically been to make the odd suggestion and step back and make room for them to excel. But for this track, he had a specialized interest that was relevant to the successful execution of the track. And I feel like he was able to step into what was probably a role that was far more professionally challenging and intellectually fulfilling than the work that he had done previously with the band.
Yeah. I mean, he taught us a lot, and I'm sure we taught him a lot by our sort of primitive musical ability, which is all I have still. And so it was a mutual benefit society, whatever they call it. He had a very great musical knowledge and background, so he could translate for us and suggest a lot of things. Well, we'd be saying, well, they go ooh and ee, and he'd say, well, look, chaps, I thought of this afternoon, and I came up with this, and we'd say, oh, great, I'll put it on here,
To put these tape loops into the mix, they essentially commandeered the entirety of EMI Studios. All over EMI Studios were tape machines with loops on them and people holding the loops at the right distance with a bit of pencil, each playing their individual clip. And then those tape machines were fed into the control room faders, and they could be brought up or brought down as the song was playing through. So they could be mixed in with the drum and the vocal take, and then that was recorded to tape. So essentially these faders were functioning almost as an instrument in and of themselves. So the mix we did then was a random thing that could never be done again. Nobody else was doing records like that at the time, with the act of capturing them on tape becoming this kind of improvisatory exercise, in that it was impossible to replicate exactly each time. And if this weren't enough innovation for a single song, let alone a single album, let alone a single band for that matter, John had complained about getting bored recording his double tracking. What that entails is John sings his vocal take, and then he has to go back and do it all over again so that they can combine the two layers and thicken the sound of his voice. He found it very tiresome. So engineer Ken Townsend effectively conceptualized automatic double tracking on the spot. It creates a delayed copy of the recorded audio and then plays it back at a slightly different speed in combination with the audio, so it sounds like two separate takes of the same song, but it only needs to have been recorded once. And we still use ADT in modern recording. George Harrison identified similarities between what John was trying to carry out with this song and the music that he had been familiarizing himself with over the break.
The indie music had come into our lives, and the way indie music just was all in one key. It didn't modulate.
I think Tomorrow Never Knows was the first one that stayed there. The whole song was on that one chord, but the basic sound all hangs on the one drone. There are also only 6 melody notes in the song, so it's kind of like an Indian raga. So George plays the sitar and the tambura on this recording. You can hear it right at the top of the track. Absolutely perfect opener for the song as well, I gotta say. And Ringo? Well, naturally, he supplied the title. The song was originally going to be called The Void.
So I gave it a throwaway title because I was a bit self-conscious about the lyrics of Tomorrow Never Knows, so I took one of Ringo's malapropisms, which was like Hard Day's Night, and to take the edge off the heavy philosophical lyrics.
What can you say? What can you say?
Oh, yeah.
Tomorrow Never Knows.
Everyone brought their best to the studio for these sessions. As George describes, there were a number of experimental things that all came together on the same song. I would wager that some of it was luck. They had George Martin's experience that they could draw from. They had Geoff Emerick's on-the-spot ideas. Some of it was probably down to the Sabbatical. Having a break from their schedule gave the Beatles time to fill their heads with new ideas, which meant that they could come back to the studio at the end of their holidays and do a little show and tell for each other. The rest, though, was that ineffable Beatle magic. All of these disparate elements could have converged to no particular effect at all. But there's something about the combination of these 4 singular individuals and their stellar support team that results in something far, far disproportionately greater than the sum of its parts. But it sort of feels like we've been talking around the song. let's give this wondrous thing a listen. John Lennon intended for this song to be a musical translation of the psychedelic experience. I think he probably succeeded, because it feels like in listening to the song you're stepping out of your regularly programmed consciousness and into something wholly novel, which is exactly what the psychedelic experience does. A few months after the recording, George Harrison said, and I quote, "This is easily the most amazing new thing we've ever come up with." And boy, he was not kidding. Here's a handful of things that I enjoy about the song. First thing is the way that it sneaks up on you. You don't know how long that drone is going to go on for. And it's sort of an unfamiliar, even slightly ominous sound, maybe. There's something creeping up on you and you don't know what it is, and then bam, the drums and the bass come in. And they're so powerful, they just completely knock you sideways. The next thing is that I think that John's natural slur is so perfectly suited to this song. He's singing it in a way that doesn't strictly adhere to the beats of the measures.
Turn off your mind, relax and float downstream.
If he were singing it in time, it would go, turn off your mind, relax and float downstream. Which, I don't have to tell you twice, sounds awful. Instead, it's like this, turn off your mind, relax and float downstream. It's very liquid, very malleable. I also think that the music and the lyrics are a great match for each other. They're otherworldly, but also radically modern. Like, how disappointing would this song be if all of this were happening musically, but the lyrics were mediocre? They're so quintessentially Lennon as well. It's scraps of things that he's been absorbing in the media, in books that he's reading, juxtaposed with his love of nonsense and wordplay. It's also kind of goon show.
For 10 years Caesar ruled with an iron hand, then with a wooden foot, and finally with a piece of string.
Kind of Lewis Carroll.
Was a brilliant and the slightly toes, a did-a-guy and give them away.
He's got lines like, play the game existence to the end of the beginning. Listen to the color of your dreams. Very abstract, very image heavy. Very John. Another thing. While the bass in this song stays on C, there is a portion at the end of each line where the chord changes down to a B flat. And it's an organ that's doing that, but there is also a clip that reinforces that. I think it's the orchestral one. There's like a moment of tension and then a resolution. It is not dying.
It is not dying.
Resolution. It's such a great delivery. Oh, love it. Love it! It's also very similar to what harmonically is being done in the previous song, Got to Get You Into My Life, where the bass is droning or staying on this one chord.
I was alone, I took a ride.
And then at the very end of each line, the chord over the top goes down a tone.
I didn't know what I would find there.
In fact, you could probably blend them. I wonder what that would sound like. Editor Nancy?
I was alone, I took a ride, I didn't know what I would find there. On the road, maybe I could see another kind of mind there.
Here's the next thing. This song could feel like the Beatles were just being pretentious and trying to be impressive and so very smart. But I don't think that it was that at all. I think that they were genuinely curious about exploring and maybe inadvertently expanding the limits of their chosen medium of music, of popular music. Quick digression, this is sort of why Revolution 9 doesn't work for me as well.
Number 9.
That does feel like John Lennon is trying to emulate something that is being done by people he admires. It feels like he is just copying. This doesn't feel like copying. This feels like something new. And it sounds like novelty that has happened upon innocently, genuinely, authentically. You know? I love that you can hear that the guitar has that trademark revolver tone, even when it's being played in reverse. There are some people who I think are under the mistaken belief that that is the same solo from Taxman. but played in reverse. And that, I think, is not the case. But just to make sure I'm right, this is what it sounds like played in reverse. I love that they switched to the Leslie vocal halfway through the song so that it sounds like John Lennon is kind of surrounding you, circling you, coming at you from different angles. This is what his voice sounds like at the beginning of the song.
Lay down for surrender to the void.
And then this is what it sounds like from like the halfway point in the song. Such an interesting tone they got out of that. What a great idea, Geoff Emerick. Well done. I love how, even to my ears in 2024, this song still sounds so modern. It feels like it could have come out any time between 1966 and now. It sounds kind of like breakbeat tracks, you know? It's a really cool song. And the last thing, it's not the last thing, the last thing I can think of today that I really love about the song is that it feels like Paul and George have all the blow you away songs. You've got Paul doing Eleanor Rigby with only a string section.
Look at all the lonely people.
Whoa, what? I know that he did it on Yesterday, but still, there isn't even guitar on Eleanor Rigby. It's just Paul and strings on a pop record. What? Or like George's Love You Too? It is such a departure from what the Beatles have been doing in their popular music practice to this point. John feels kind of underrepresented in that respect on the album, but I love that he gets the big finish. I quoted George at the top of this section. Here's the rest of that quote. Some people might say it sounds like a terrible mess of sound. It's because of the electronics, which might throw you at first, but the song ought to be looked on as interesting if people listen to it with open ears. And he's right. I first heard this song as a 6-year-old, and to a 6-year-old, everything is novel. You have no precedent for what anything sounds like. But I'm now a much older listener to this song. I'm far more familiar with what it sounds like when music is electronically or digitally altered. And so I have to keep reminding myself that this was not the case for this song's original listeners in 1966. These guys were the first to do this in popular music. So for those mid-60s listeners, many of these sounds would have been totally unidentifiable, which I think would have made the song sound impossible and miraculous. Like, I listen to that and I'm like, oh yeah, that sounds like something being played backwards. Oh yeah, that sounds like a loop of tape. And some of you won't have to imagine this, but for the rest of us, can you imagine listening to this and just having not a clue what it is that you're listening to or how these sounds have been made? What a cool experience. Let us conclude. This song represented a new frontier. It was the kickoff point for many things. It is the root of an entire tree of endless genres and subgenres of popular music to come. It was a radical reinvention of the recording practices of the time, and these new techniques were quickly adopted by all of the other studios because their artists were demanding that they make their rhythm section sound as good as this. It established a precedent for the kind of experimentation that up until this point was unique to these very specific circles of artsy people to go mainstream. Paul said something really interesting that I would like to quote for you now. We came down from the north, experienced London, where quite experimental things were happening, and we always thought the people back home would love to know. We felt like we were the megaphones. If it was happening to us and we like it, we should let them know. It would be good to pass on the good news. How altruistic. This resulted in an absolute explosion of creativity that lasted at the very least until the end of the decade. It gave artists license to be weird. And while this track is the start of many things, it is also a decisive end of the beginning. After the release of this album, the Beatles did one final tour, and they didn't play any of this material on the tour, quite simply because they couldn't. They couldn't execute it live. And sort of, almost cartoonishly, they finished their recording, they finished the tour, they disappeared for a bit, and then they all came back with big man moustaches.
Did you ever see a time when, in fact, you weren't
working together?
I could see us working not together for a period, but we'd always get together for one reason or other.
Do you foresee a time when, in fact, the Beatles won't be together and that you'll all be on your own?
No.
Do you think that in the new year that you're going to be going your own ways instead of being a group?
No.
If you never toured again, would it worry you?
I don't know. No, I don't think so.
It's almost like a comical representation of their newfound maturity. Paul very proudly brought this work to Bob Dylan after they'd wrapped recording but before they had released, to show off what he'd been working on and what they had produced. And Bob Dylan said to him, "Oh, I get it. You don't want to be cute anymore. Allow me to rant briefly. This is the kind of insecure, too cool for school, soft boy nonsense that I used to come across from the private school bros when I was majoring in English at university. Process your envy elsewhere, Bobby." Having said that, he was not entirely off the mark. After listening to Tomorrow Never Knows, there is no way that you can mistake these Beatles for the lovable mop tops who broke onto the scene 3 years earlier. Even though, at the time of this recording, they were only aged between 23 and 25. These four guys had evolved into something unrecognizable from who they were in their earlier 20s. That stage of their lives was over. Tomorrow Never Knows signals the end of the beginning of the Beatles. That's it for me. Oh man, I'm sad that it's over. This has been such an incredible experience and such a journey going from track to track through this album. I'm so grateful to all of you who tuned in and went on this journey with me. It's been a massive undertaking, and I think it's probably the thing I am most proud of in my sort of YouTube channel and the things that I do in this corner of the internet. And I feel so honored and so pleased that you have shared this with me. So what's next? What now? I think I'd like to sort of round up the album a little bit. It feels kind of incomplete to just end on the last song and not look at the album as a whole. Look at the songs in the context of their greater project. So maybe some of that. I've had a lot of requests to cover the singles for this album. Twist my arm, I'll do it. I'm actually really excited about it. I'm so glad that you made that request. And then next year, I don't know, maybe we'll do this again with a new album. If that's something you might be interested in, let me know. If you enjoyed this series, I'll leave a link in the description to my Buy Me a Coffee page, where you are most welcome to make a donation, but no pressure, friends. I would like to thank, in a most heartfelt fashion, each and every one of you who has made a donation or signed up as a member. It means the world to me. I really appreciate you. Thank you so much. If you're curious about what any of my original music sounds like, I'll leave a link for that in the description as well. And with that, thanks for hanging out with me. I'll see you here next week. Have a great weekend. Oh, wow. I am so sad that's over. Oh well. There are many more Beatles albums out there. Stories for another day. Testing, testing. 1, 2, 3! You folks are going to be seeing a lot of me this episode. Just elbowed my lamp. They don't like that, traditionally. And all the avant-garde artists, while John was living a comfortable... I think it's probably a possum. I just wonder... Seriously, again? I think there are multiple possums, and I think they're waging some sort of a territory war on our roof. Yeah, I'm flummoxed as well. In 1962, he had worked with Maddalena Fagandini. Jesus. Maddalena Fagandini. No, that's not right. Maddalena Fagandini. No. Let me try again. Who's gonna stop me? Now, this is completely off the topic of the Beatles, but I hope you'll indulge me because my grandfather was full of malapropisms. And the first time that he saw full frontal nudity on television, he went running into the next room to tell my grandmother that there was a full front noodle on the TV. Oh, I forgot to mention that! The piano at the end. It was just Paul messing around in the studio. And they caught it on tape and stuck it onto the end of the recording. Very cool. Just a little bit of levity at the end of this very serious ending to the album. Ha-ha!
The power is yours!